Hello. I'm in a silly mood today, so I thought I'd watch some absolute brain rot and laugh at it. What's more likely is that I'll just get annoyed and you'll be entertained at my expense, but oh well. To pick a video, I was sent several from our favorite one-stop shop of brain rot, PragerU. Let's see what our old buddy Dennis is up to, shall we? The first video is titled, Is Communism Moral? Now, we can get into an entire discussion on what morality is and how we can measure it, but we'll get into all that. Let's start the video.
Motives are much less important than behavior. We all know this. If someone has good intentions but treats people badly, those good intentions mean nothing. As it is with individuals, so it is with governments. Capitalism might sound less noble than communism. The individual pursues success to the best of his abilities. That's capitalism. Versus everyone shares everything equally. That's communism.
I'm always surprised by how quickly these videos devolve into outright lies. Like, at least make an attempt to be objective. Both definitions are wrong, unsurprisingly. Capitalism is not when an individual pursues success to the best of their abilities, nor is communism everyone shares everything equally. You can't abstract these very real concepts away with fluffy language, and even more so for a scam that calls itself a university. They should know better than to fail to properly define terms. Capitalism is a socioeconomic system based on the ownership of private property, wage labor, the presence of markets, and the division of society into two general class groupings, proletariat and bourgeoisie.
Communism
is a stateless, moneyless, and classless society that is the next stage to follow after socialism. It's decently encapsulated in the oft-quoted, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Lenin even wrote a hilarious article titled A Liberal Professor on Equality, debunking this intentionally used and abused misconception. Nice to see that Marxists dunking on liberals is a tradition that goes back over a century.
But it is capitalism that has produced freedom, and it alone has lifted millions from poverty, while communism has kept millions impoverished and, without exception, crushed freedom.
Yeah, flip those statements around and you'd be correct. First of all, freedom is an abstract idea, and Dennis here intentionally doesn't define it because he knows it's not in his favor. Under capitalism, you're fully free to be homeless, unemployed, uneducated, overworked, underrepresented politically and economically, not have any say over how your workplace is organized, and so much more. Man, what would we do without all this freedom? To quote Lenin, freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in ancient Greek republics, freedom for slave owners. The absolute wealthiest within society have the sole freedom to own massive amounts of capital, even extending to the air we breathe and water we drink. If you're not part of this small sacred group, tough luck. Furthermore, the vast majority of poverty alleviation that's taken place over the past century has been within socialist countries, and in the 21st century, almost exclusively within the People's Republic of China. You know, that one, run by a communist party. Again, you can't play the silly game of China's capitalist when something good happens, and China's communist when it's something supposedly bad. PragerU has done that nonsense in other videos, and I won't just casually look over this blinding hypocrisy. Also, socialism across the board has resulted in superior outcomes for their populations when compared with capitalist countries. I've made several videos about this. The point is just very tired. PragerU obviously exists to satisfy ideological biases rather than provide legitimate arguments.
Capitalism, for all its imperfections, enables a decent society. Communism, whatever its stated intentions, leads to evil. Yet increasingly, people either ignore or deny the evil of this ideology, which within a period of only 60 years created modern totalitarianism and deprived more people of human rights and tortured and killed more people than any ideology in history.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Firstly, define decent. Is Somalia decent? Or Peru? Or Bangladesh? Those are all capitalist countries, and much closer to the general average of what capitalism provides globally. Also, isn't our baby boy Dennis here American? The country that has children going to debt to pay for school lunches, and teachers working like 3 jobs just to make ends meet? Where school shootings are an actually frequent occurrence and minorities are shot on the street by police? Where there exists literal armies of homeless right next to peopleless homes? Where a single cancer diagnosis can bankrupt entire families, and practically everyone is living on credit? Where most Americans can't afford a $500 emergency, and the government spends trillions on war instead of healthcare and education. Some definition of decent you must have. As for communism leading to evil, again, define what evil is. Hold on, they kinda do that in a loose way. Totalitarianism, deprivation of human rights, and the murder of innocents. I can't be the only one that thinks this sounds a lot like the US, no? Did we forget American drone strikes on sheep herders and weddings? The Korean War, Vietnam War, Iraq War, hell, the recent 20-year debacle in Afghanistan. Again, how innocent minorities are shot on the street. How the US literally dropped 2 nuclear weapons on civilian centers despite Japan already being fully ready to surrender. As for totalitarianism, why is it that the US, the capitalist haven, almost exclusively monopolizes support for dictators around the world, both modern as well as historic? This is why I generally dislike PragerU nonsense. These are platitudes mixed in with lies, there's nothing concrete here. The 3 quadrillion killed stats is just blatant dishonesty, and I've covered that in another video. They literally count dead Nazis as part of that toll. And the civil rights argument is incorrect to say the least. If you're genuinely interested in the topic, then one book I'd recommend is Albert Szymanski's Human Rights in the Soviet Union, in which comparisons are drawn to the US as well. Great book, I highly recommend it. Regardless, I really dislike counting deaths, but if you really wanted to, capitalism within the last several decades has resulted in unparalleled limitations on human rights, and in hundreds of millions of premature or otherwise preventable deaths. This is not an argument in which capitalism comes out looking better or even good. It just goes to show how far gone some people like our baby boy Dennis really are.
How can we explain this? There are 2 ways. One is ignorance. People just don't know the truth about communism.
I agree. People don't know anything about communism because they hear nonsense like this every day. Right next to the 5th grade history book chapters about how Native Americans simply moved out to make room for settlers, there's entire chapters of Cold Warrior lies and misconceptions on everything from what socialism and communism are to what the Soviet Union, Cuba, etc. were like and how those systems were set up. Think, there's a reason why they need to lie so much about both former and current socialisms. They're not perfect systems by any means, but a system supposedly so barbaric wouldn't require around-the-clock propaganda shoved down your throat to get that point across, now would it?
The second is willful blindness. People know the truth, but choose to ignore it because the truth about communism's horrors is too painful to confront.
But capitalism's A-okay, right?
Given the sad state of our educational system, we can assume most people fall into the first category, they just don't know. So let me offer some facts. But before I do, I need to address another question. Why is it important that everyone know what communism did? Here are 3 reasons. First, we have a moral obligation to the victims of communism not to forget them. Just as Americans have a moral obligation to remember the victims of slavery, we have the same obligation to the billion victims of communism, especially the 100 million who were murdered.
Oh, boo-hoo, Hitler and his buddies commit self-delete or found themselves with shrapnel lodged in their hippocampus. Those aren't victims, those are criminals. Also, billion victims? Is this just some generic statement? The population of China is higher than that, and the combined populations of former socialist nations weren't at 1 billion, depending on what area you're counting. It just seems strange and arbitrary, even more so than what we're used to with PragerU. The 100 million is the usual rounding up at every turn, counting people who weren't born, extrapolating birth rates, and, need I remind you, counting dead Nazis as quote-unquote victims of communism, all of which isn't academically sound, nor is it even considered by any decent human being. I again refer you to the video I made on this here.
Second, the best way to prevent an evil from reoccurring is to confront it in all its horror. The fact that many people today, especially young people, mention communism as a viable option for modern society proves they don't know communism's moral record. Therefore, they do not properly fear communism, which means this evil could happen again. And why could it happen again? That brings us to reason number 3. The leaders of communist regimes and the vast number of people who help those leaders torture, enslave, and murder were nearly all normal people. Of course, some were psychopaths, but most were not.
I honestly don't know why I'm even bothering. If anyone watches this and doesn't have at least some level of critical thinking, some level of, maybe I'm just being a recipient of blatant, unsubstantiated propaganda right now, well then there's not much I can do to change that. Bombastic language, literal fire-breathing dragon iconography, of course, continuing the long-standing anti-communist tradition of making communists seem cool as fuck, and just bad argumentation covered up by smooth editing betrays the fact that they pretty much don't respect whoever's watching and consider them idiots stupid enough to fall for this garbage.
Which means that any society, including free ones, can devolve into communism or some analogous evil.
Mentions free society, puts up an image of the US. The jokes really tell themselves, honestly.
Now some facts. Based on the authoritative Black Book of Communism,
Ding, 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 ding. The literal worst piece of scholarship on Soviet and socialist studies to exist. And believe me, there's a lot of garbage out there. is their primary source. How lovely. To get you up to speed, well, why don't I just quote part of the video I mentioned earlier? So why is the Black Book problematic? Well, how about a quick fire round? They count Nazi deaths in World War II as part of communism's death toll. This point alone is enough to condemn this book to the trash can. Not only this, but they count other things like civilian deaths that occurred as a result of the American invasion of Vietnam, through some strange logic, as part of the death toll of communism. Rigorous academics, these authors are. Two of the main authors have admitted to having far lower estimates, nearly half as much as the widely publicized 100 million mark. So why publish under the sensationalist 100 million figure? It includes people who weren't born as deaths, because, that makes sense. Basically, fertility rates went down in, for example, a famine. A woman who would have had 4 kids now only had 2, because, again, having more kids in a famine is a bad idea. Those 2 kids that could have been born, but never really existed, victims of communism. I hope you see how fucking ridiculous this is. I recall somebody doing something similar with US fertility trends just for the meme and got something like 4 or 5 million excess deaths. It'd be hilarious if it weren't taken seriously. Outright invention of numbers, sometimes even throwing on 10, 20,000, or even 5 million deaths on a number just to be safe, practically pulling numbers out of their ass, unsourced of course. Counting pogromists that would round up and murder Jews, rightfully punished by the Soviets, as victims of communism, oh boy. And finally, the nail in the coffin is that 2 of the 3 main authors publicly distanced themselves from the book, saying that Courtois, the main author, had an unhealthy obsession with getting to the 100 million number. Again, evidence be damned. It's a propaganda piece, plain and simple, and funnily enough, it only reinforces how stupid of an argument it is. To quote Chomsky, supposing we now apply the methodology of the Black Book to India, that democratic capitalist experiment has caused more deaths than in the entire history of communism everywhere since 1917. Over 100 million deaths by 1979, and tens of millions more since, in India alone. Now that you're up to speed, let's see what Penis has to say.
Written by 6 French scholars and published in the United States by Harvard University Press.
A boring appeal to authority, the work has been academically torn apart and literally no modern researcher takes even part of it seriously, yet Penis here doesn't say anything about that now, does he?
Here are the numbers of people murdered by communist regimes. Not soldiers, ordinary civilians.
Nice to know literal SS officers and their goons aren't considered soldiers now. Ho, Dennis, who will you rehabilitate now? You'd think if, when arguing against a point, you'd start defending literal Nazis, just maybe you'd reconsider your position on what thought path led you to being in that unsavory place. Maybe.
Vietnam, 1 million. Eastern Europe, 1 million. Ethiopia, 1.5 million. North Korea, 2 million. Cambodia, 2 million. The Soviet Union, 20 million. China, 65 million. And the numbers are conservative.
Again, another blatant lie. Some of the authors admitted to inflating numbers, and the statistics of the book count imaginary people. I don't have the energy to detail all the numbers, so quick fire round. Vietnam, a war literally started by the US and other capitalist countries. Cambodia, literally supported by the US and finally stopped by, gasp, communist Vietnam. The USSR, inflated figures based on outdated research and counting of famine deaths during a time when the heavily economically sanctioned USSR wasn't even recognized as a country by the US, isn't exactly fair. When famines happen under capitalism, they don't fall under a capitalist death toll, so why the double standard? That's a rhetorical question, you know why. For China, there's a great article titled Did Mao Really Kill Millions in the Great Leap Forward? That you can check out. Literally all the rest is along the same vein. If you're really interested, I've attached a link in the pinned comment to a master post with all the relevant info. Check out the further reading section.
And of course, these numbers do not describe the suffering endured by hundreds of millions of people who were not murdered. The systematic stripping people of their right to speak freely, to worship freely, to start a business, or even to travel without party permission. No non-communist judiciary or media.
The only one of these that can even be kinda fair is the worship freely part, and even that has so much nuance that it technically isn't true. Under socialism, you could criticize your manager and even get them fired. Under capitalism, you can't do that. Hell, you're not even guaranteed a job, a pension, sick leave, maternity or paternity leave, I could go on. Starting a business is an impossibility for the vast majority of people under capitalism, and even within the richest country on earth is little more than a pipe dream. Remember, a population that can't afford a $500 emergency will definitely not have the capital necessary to start a business. Traveling without permission is absolutely ridiculous. Many capitalist countries would simply refuse entry to people from, for example, the USSR or other socialist countries. Hell, they still do that to this day, even from other poorer capitalist countries. Furthermore, you could travel within the socialist sphere, and arguably more people travel that way, as travel, even today, is incredibly expensive. Also, this was a consequence of geopolitics of the era. This is nothing specific to socialism. The vast majority of people from the third world can't travel either, but I won't be as unfair as to say, capitalism limits opportunity to travel, despite the fact that technically it does. No access to a non-communist legal system and media can go the other way around. Under capitalism, you have no access to non-capitalist legal systems or media. None of this is the heavy criticism you think it is.
The poverty of nearly all communist countries.
Say it with me now. Under equal levels of economic development, socialist countries consistently provided a higher level of development than their capitalist counterparts. That's what the research states. Also, Dennis here pretends like capitalism is only Western Europe and North America. It's not. Dhaka, Mogadishu, and Lima are just as much capitalist as Oslo, LA, and Seoul. The hilariously sad part is that even within these capitalist havens, poverty is still a very real and ever-present issue. Half of South Korea's elderly are in poverty. 1 in 5 are in poverty in LA, for example, and that's with the soft guidelines for poverty the US provides. The real number is very likely to be much higher. This is reality, something Prager over here is not in touch with.
The imprisonment of vast numbers of people.
This is rich, coming from a country with the highest population of prisoners on Earth. The point doesn't even deserve elaboration, honestly. Just read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
And of course, the trauma suffered by the hundreds of millions of friends and relatives of the murdered and imprisoned.
At the hands of US imperialism and fascist police violence at home. Being blind to one's own biases must be comforting.
People associate evil with darkness. But that's not accurate. It is easy to look into the dark. It is very hard to stare into bright light. One should therefore associate evil with extreme brightness, given that people rarely look at real evil. And those who do not confront real evil often make up evils, like systemic racism in 21st century America, or toxic masculinity, or patriarchy, that are much easier to confront.
I'm sorry, what? What was that now? Do people genuinely take this shit seriously? Systemic racism isn't an issue anymore. Toxic masculinity hasn't ruined millions of men in relation to their own self-image and how they relate to women and other men. Patriarchy just doesn't exist. I'd like to live on this guy's planet, holy shit.
The book of Psalms states, "Those of you who love God must hate evil."
Yeah, and the Bible also states, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Sounds pretty socialist to me. Silliness aside, cherry-picking random Bible verses and not being true to your religious tradition is the mark of a hypocrite. And what does the Bible say about that? Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. As a staunch defender of capitalism, you are brazen about your hatred of mankind because you value profits over people's lives. Be a true Christian and fight through word or deed to dismantle this unrighteous system. Or continue to be a servant of usury and finance, up to you.
If you don't believe in God, here's another way of putting it. Those of you who love people must hate evil. If you don't hate communism, you don't care about, much less love, people.
Couldn't be further from the truth. We're the ones who want all to be fed, housed, educated, and within dignified employment. Hell, we achieved it. You're the one who values your stock portfolio over immigrants beckoning at your border, minimum wage employees, and single mothers. You're the one who bumps elbows with millionaires and billionaires, even receiving funding for this little farce of yours from them. Meanwhile, we fight for the rights of the powerless. To quote the Brazilian Archbishop Camara, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint, but when I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist. And the video's done. If you take a look at their garbage sources, you'd find some opinion pieces about Vuvuzela, with the same old tired arguments, where they call pre-1959 Cuba a vibrant modern island nation, completely omitting the massive illiteracy problem, lack of access to healthcare, how most Cuban peasants lived in straw huts, the fascist dictatorship, the mafia problems. There was a reason the rebels were so popular, you know. The next source they use is a book review of the Black Book of Communism from the year 2000. They do that intentionally because anything newer will ruthlessly point out the serious deficiencies of the book, rendering it basically a propaganda piece and not serious scholarship. The rest of the sources are just other PragerU videos with similar levels of rigorously academic sources. Basically either libertarian think tank opinion pieces, really outdated research that no one takes seriously, or just plain old trust me bro. I was gonna do 2 other PragerU videos right after this one in some kind of bundle, but I honestly can't handle any more of this. I did this to have fun. I did not have fun.